emergency special session is meeting to find lasting solutions to the emergency crisis in the Middle East that the Security Council seems once again to be able to offer a way out to. We regret that Canada's amendment was not adopted. Hamas and their actions since the start of this crisis have brought great suffering to the people of Israel and Palestine. My delegation voted in favor of the resolution only because, in light of the inaction of the Security Council and the urgent need to protect innocent civilians, the international community could not wait any longer. But it is very clear Costa Rica reiterates its strongest condemnation of the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October. These actions have no justification whatsoever. Hamas has shown itself to be a terrorist organization with no consideration for the most basic principles of human rights. Our solidarity, our absolute solidarity, goes with Israel and to all victims since the beginning of the crisis. We recognize that Israel has the right to self-defense in light of the horrific attacks of the group called Hamas, which does not represent the Palestinian people. Hamas should release all of the hostages. It should put down its weapons. All of those involved in the actions of the 7th of October should hand themselves over and be judged for their genocidal acts. We also condemn the use by Hamas of people and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools, as shields in infringement of international humanitarian law. We are deeply concerned by the escalation of violence, and we remind the parties of the obligation to adhere to international law, especially international humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions and its protocols and customary international humanitarian law. Even in situations of conflict, there are rules. The most sacred of these rules is respect and protection for the life and security of all civilian people. The fundamental principles of international humanitarian law provide us with clear guidance in times of war. The principles of differentiation and proportionality are crucial. Access to humanitarian assistance is obligatory and it is urgently needed. The protection of civilians and those outside of combat is a very basic need. The specific vulnerabilities of the civilian population should be taken into account. A person with a physical disability cannot listen to an evacuation warning in the same way that a healthy person does and cannot follow the instructions in the same way. Also, children find that their fragility is increased in times of conflict. President Costa Rica notes with great concern the humanitarian tragedy that has resulted from the conflict. We stand in solidarity with all of the innocent victims, both in Israel and in Palestine. In accordance with the above, we wish to make the following calls urgently. First of all, we call again for the immediate and unconditional release of all of the hostages held by Hamas. Taking hostages in an armed conflict is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. The fact that amongst the hostages, we also know that there are boys and children and the elderly, makes this situation even more serious. Secondly, humanitarian access that is secure, swift and unhindered must be ensured. Humanitarian actors need guarantees of clear, practical and permanent access in order to assist a population that is in desperate need, including through humanitarian breaks and corridors when necessary. None of these elements can be conditional upon any of the others. All of these are humanitarian imperatives in their own right. Finally, we call for an immediate ceasefire against civilians. our priority should be to avoid any further loss of life of innocents and any further suffering. Costa Rica also calls for a transfer of conventional weapons to the zone of conflict to be suspended in accordance with Articles 6 and 7 of the Treaty on the weapons trade. These weapons can be used to commit or facilitate grave violations of international humanitarian law and human rights. The only way to bring us closer to a lasting peace is to avoid creating further innocent victims and preventing further escalation of the conflict. President, Costa Rica underscores that the only sustainable solution to this crisis will be the establishment of two states that live in conditions of security under a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. Peace is possible, but it requires a firm commitment from all. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Costa Rica and now invite the distinguished representative of Maldives to take the floor.
Mr. President, we gather here under the Uniting for Peace resolution adopted by this Assembly in 1950. Each time that we have gathered under this resolution to address the issue of illegal Israeli action in occupied East Jerusalem and the occupied Palestinian territory, it is with profound shock that we are confronted with unrelenting images of human suffering. We welcome last Friday's resolution by this Assembly advocating for an immediate, enduring, and sustainable humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. We strongly urge the Security Council to unite and take resolute action to halt the violence against innocent civilians. Mr. President, the reality on ground is that of the 2 million residents in Gaza, half of them are children. 30% of those children are under the age of 10. And today, it is these young children that are suffering the most. Accepting the loss of these young lives as mere collateral damage is a severe breach of universally accepted ethical principles. It is a severe breach of international law, including the Geneva Conventions and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the standards that reflect the global consensus that the lives of innocent children must be safeguarded at all costs. It is a severe breach of our shared human values and diminishes the moral integrity of any society that chooses to tolerate it. Mr. President, the Maldives was accepted to the United Nations in 1965 as its smallest member. In our very first statement to this esteemed Assembly, our permanent representative stated, "Whatever the size of a country or its population, a free state can make a contribution to the cause of coexistence." These words, our commitment to the principles of United Nations Charter and our commitment to the rule of law continue to guide our work at the United Nations. This is why, though oceans apart, Maldivians remain resolute in our support for Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause. In this recent conflict, the Maldives has donated 2 million cans of tuna to the people of Palestine. Though modest, it is a gesture that underscores our enduring commitment and unwavering solidarity with the people of Palestine. The people of Maldives are also making financial contributions and organizing fundraisers to provide support to our brothers and sisters in Palestine. We will continue to speak up for the Palestinian people, for the Palestinian cause, and for peace in the region. Our support is driven not only by our principles, but also by a moral obligation. We once again reaffirm our unwavering support for the Palestinian people in their legitimate quest for their inalienable rights, including self-determination. We are resolute in our belief that enduring peace can only materialize through the creation of a sovereign Palestinian state, founded on pre-1967 borders and with East Jerusalem as its capital. Mr. President, what we are witnessing today is not a conflict that started earlier this month, but a continuation of decades of oppression of Palestinian people that have shattered multiple lives and suffocated hopes of innocent people over several generations. We firmly believe in equal application of the rule of law among all states. Accountability must be enforced for violations of international and humanitarian laws, eschewing selective justice. This conflict is therefore not merely a legal issue. It is a fundamental matter of justice. But we have witnessed selective justice in play throughout this crisis. The evident double standard in the global narrative of this protracted conflict is concerning. The partiality, knowingly or unknowingly, serves to dehumanize and minimize, enabling and even justifying indiscriminate violence and further marginalizing the Palestinian perspective. Mr. President, the settlement of Israel-Palestine conflict is one of the major issues in which the United Nations Security Council has repeatedly failed. It has failed to take unified stance against acts of violence and hostilities directed at civilians and the protection of medical and humanitarian personnel as stipulated by international humanitarian law. These failures undermine the Council's legitimacy. We take this opportunity to emphasize the urgent need for reform of the Security Council to ensure its continued relevance and effectiveness in upholding global peace and security. We reiterate our call to the Security Council to act decisively, building upon this Assembly's efforts to halt violence against innocent civilians. Mr. President, the rapidly escalating crisis in Gaza has reached an alarming point, demanding urgent and immediate action. As airstrikes increase and the death toll climbs now over 8,000, a ground invasion has commenced, even as the Assembly calls for a ceasefire. The situation gravely threatens to expand the conflict further. The government of Maldives strongly condemns the attacks on medical facilities, including Al-Ahli Arab Hospital, and most recently the continuous bombardment surrounding the Indonesian hospital, Al-Shifa Hospital, the Turkish hospital, and Al-Quds Hospital. We condemn the unacceptable attack on residential areas of the Jabalia refugee camp just this morning. The attacks on places of worship and humanitarian workers. These actions not only cause irreversible damage to essential infrastructure, but also place the lives of thousands at dire risk, violating international law and basic human decency. We urgently call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and for strict adherence to international mandates safeguarding civilian infrastructure and personnel. UN agencies are sounding the alarm about a dire humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza. We extend our heartfelt condolences to all families affected. Our thoughts are also with the humanitarian workers who have sacrificed their lives in service, including the loss of over 60 UN staff in Gaza. The Maldives is grateful to the UN, Egypt, and others for facilitating the entry of humanitarian aid through the Rafah border crossing. However, this is insufficient. We urge Israel to collaborate with its neighboring states to ensure uninterrupted humanitarian assistance and the delivery of essential services at the required scale. The blockade of Gaza must end to mitigate the acute humanitarian crisis. We echo the calls for respect for the rule of law and genuine political engagement to find a diplomatic, sustainable, and lasting solution. The Palestinians have placed their hope in international law, the UN Charter, and our multilateral system for their survival. It is abhorrent that we have allowed this hope to be met with nothing but hollow words. The sanctity of innocent life, particularly that of children, is non-negotiable. Tonight, when I go home, I can hold my son as he falls asleep in my arms. But how many Palestinian mothers and fathers are mourning the loss of their children? We implore the members of this august assembly to act with courage, not as a matter of political convenience, but as a moral duty that transcends borders and politics, for the sake of a more peaceful world. The lives of innocent children and families in Gaza hang in the balance. War is indeed not an answer. This emergency special session must continue to unite us. It must fuel our collective conscience to bring justice, dignity, and security to the Palestinians and to the Middle East. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Maldives for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lebanon.
السيد الرئيس.
Mr. President, my delegation welcomes the adoption of the resolution entitled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations presented by the Arab Group, which is considered to be the first serious step by the United Nations to end the suffering, humanitarian suffering in Gaza. Sir, we find ourselves today before the UN General Assembly in an exceptional manner, because the natural place that is to address those matters that threaten international peace and security is the Security Council. But some of the members of the Council have decided to grant time to Israel so that they would be able to complete their military battle, as if 75 years of conflict were not enough. And it is enough to complete the Israeli plan to displace Palestinians from the land and replace them with other illegal settlers. Mr. President, we must show our unity to reach an immediate ceasefire and to end a senseless aggression. We must open safe corridors to deliver basic goods for the relief of civilians in besieged Gaza. Also, we must rescue the wounded and save those lives that can be saved. We must also block any project of forced displacement of the Palestinian people. Palestine is the only natural place for these inhabitants. Mr. President, the Israeli-Arab conflict, for which many international resolutions have been passed without being implemented by Israel, is not a new conflict. Its repercussions will not end if there is no sincere will to resolve it. Experience so far has shown that this issue will not be resolved unless the international community assumes its responsibilities by pressuring Israel to implement the relevant international resolutions and compel it to withdraw from occupied Arab territories, and also to recognize the Palestinians' right to exist and live in their own independent state within these 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Otherwise, this struggle will continue for generations and generations after us. Mr. President, the ongoing Israeli attacks on Lebanon affecting peaceful villages along the border have forced more than 20,000 Lebanese to flee their homes in search of safety and security. The repeated attacks on the Lebanese army and UNIFIL positions do not discriminate between military personnel, civilians, journalists, and aid workers. And the use of internationally banned substances such as white phosphorus are flagrant violations of international resolutions, Resolution 1071 and international humanitarian law. Sir, these Israeli violations, which Lebanon has been witnessing for the past 3 weeks, are added to Israel's record full of violations against Lebanon's sovereignty and land, part of which is still occupied in the Sheba farm area, in Kafra Shuba, and the outskirts of the town of Al-Mari, which includes, in part, the urban expansion of the village of Gashar. We call on the international community to pressure Israel to stop its destructive aggression and repeated violations, and its constant fraud. Mr. President, Israel is launching a major aggression against the Gaza Strip from the air, sea, and land. The certain result is thousands of innocent civilians will become victims, and therefore it is imperative that we act immediately. This is a responsibility shared by all countries to stop the bloodbath that does not distinguish between an infant, a mother, or an older person. We must beware any plans to spread chaos and internal disputes within the Palestinian areas. Today, the world is facing two choices: either remain silent about the transformation of Gaza into a mass grave of more than 2 million Palestinians, or immediately stop this war and start the path of a political solution based on UN resolutions. Mr. President, from this international rostrum, Lebanon calls for an end to the deaths, to the exoduses, the massacres, before it's too late. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Lebanon, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Yemen.
السيد الرئيس.
President, I thank you for the resumption of the 10th emergency session of the General Assembly under the agenda item United for Peacekeeping. We align ourselves with the statement made by His Excellency the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Jordan on behalf of the Arab Group, and the statement delivered by the representative of Mauritania on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Sir, this meeting is being held after the failure of the Security Council to assume its responsibilities in accordance with the UN Charter when it comes to international peace and security. At a time when the brutal aggressions continues against Gaza and daily massacres are committed by Israel, the occupying power, against innocent and defenseless citizens, women and children. This aggression, this brutality, constitutes a war of genocide against the Palestinians. The Yemeni people condemn with the strongest terms possible, the brutal and continuous Israeli aggression on Gaza and the destruction of infrastructure and the targeting of civilians, especially women and children, without discrimination. And this, we also condemn the cutting off of electricity and food and medications from the civilian population. This is a full-fledged war crime, a crime against humanity, and a flagrant violation of international law and human rights and international humanitarian law, as well as all international norms and standards. We wish to express our deepest condolences to the martyrs and their families, and we share our best wishes for a speedy recovery for the wounded. We wish to warn you that these actions will have serious consequences that will not only disrupt the peace process in the Middle East, but will also exacerbate this wave of violence and chaos, and it will increase feelings of anger in the region. This will give terrorist and extremist groups more reasons to spread bloodshed throughout the region and the world. We're meeting today when Gaza has paid with the blood of its sons and daughters. There are more than 7,000 martyrs who have fallen, including 3,400 children and 2,500 women. Some were buried alive under the rubble. More than 2,000 women and more than 20,000 wounded, of which 75% were children and women, are also a significant. There are also 2,000 people still to be found under the rubble. There was a new massacre that took place today in the Jabalia camp in the Gaza Strip, which led to approximately 400 dead and wounded, the majority of which were women and children. Today, we're meeting when Israel, the occupying power, has destroyed hospitals, health centers, schools, mosques, and churches. We are meeting today while Israel has destroyed a third of the Gaza Strip already and is razing its buildings to the ground. We meet today while Israel has stopped the provision of fuel, electricity, and food to 2.5 million people. And with all of this destruction, this aggression, massacres, and ethnic cleansing, some still hesitate to call things by their names and condemn these crimes against humanity and flagrant violations of human rights, international humanitarian law, and international law. This is a clear picture of the double standards that prevail in the world today. Yesterday, from this rostrum, many delegations spoke and lectured us about the principles of human rights, of international law, and human conscience. And they tried to preserve the high moral ground and condemned the war and brutal violations due to the killings of civilians and the siege. And today, we see them either silent or biased in violation of these same principles. We in Yemen understand these double standards, for many have given us lectures on human rights and infrastructure protection. This is a dark time for humanity and for the international system. The worsening of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the failure of the international community to stop the scourge that has exceeded all limits and stop this war is a moral failure. And now it is a failure of the application of international law and protecting common human values and innocent civilians. The silence on the part of the international community is complicity in crime and cover-up. Today, the infrastructure has been destroyed. Children and women have been killed. entire families have been exterminated. Is this self-defense? Have international legal standards become optional according to color, sex, and religion? Has the application of these standards stopped at the borders of Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territory? All these questions need answers. We are facing a crossroads. We can either triumph for humanity and human conscience, or we will lose our humanity. Mr. President, we reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire and access, unfettered access of humanitarian aid and medical staff, and access to health centers and medical centers as well. Israel's prevention of urgent humanitarian aid into Gaza and forcing the citizens of the Gaza Strip to flee their houses is a grave violation of international law and international humanitarian law, and we reject the forced displacement of Palestinians outside their homeland or the threat of it. This is a violation of international law and the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949. What happened on October 7th, 2023 is the result of continued Israeli occupation over the course of 75 years. Therefore, a just and comprehensive peace is the only way to end this conflict, strengthen security and stability in the region, and establish an independent and sovereign Palestinian state on the borders of June 4th, 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital, in accordance with the resolutions of international legitimacy and the Arab initiatives. Without this solution, the region will know no stability. Sir, allow me to wonder how much blood how will be spilt before the public conscience awakens and stops this. If the international conscience is unable to win for the innocent Palestinians, then at least it has to triumph, or this will be a failure for humanity in the 21st century. What would you say if your children asked you, what did you do to stop the massacre against the children of Gaza? We, along with all of our supporters, the supporters of truth, the international community, the Charter, and the principles of the United Nations, are on the right side of history, and history will record on which side you will stand. The international community, facing these crimes committed by the Israeli occupying power against civilians in Gaza, including women and children, we ask them to take on the criminal responsibility of Israel. Criminals must be brought to justice and must be punished. The principles of humanity, justice, independence, and international law will prevail and triumph, and force will not triumph over the power of right. In conclusion, we thank all member states who voted in favor of the draft resolution of the General Assembly, which focused on the importance of stopping the war and protecting civilians, and to allow the arrival of humanitarian aid in a rapid manner, and to respect international legal constraints. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Yemen, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Somalia.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I express my deep appreciation for the prompt and timely reconvening of the General Assembly's 10th Emergency Special Session on the question of Palestine. A time yet another tragically marked in the long history of the Palestinian people, who continue to be under occupation for half a century. we align ourselves with the statement delivered on behalf of the Arab Group and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation by Jordan and Mauritania, respectively. The ongoing conflict has resulted in countless lives being lost and a humanitarian crisis that can no longer be ignored. At the outset, I would like to begin by expressing my heartfelt condolences to the Palestinian people and government over the loss of thousands of innocent civilian lives, including women and children of Al-Ahli Arab Hospital, and offer my wishes for the speedy recovery of the injured ones. I pray Almighty God to bestow His strength and resilience on the people of Palestine. The protection of civilians is a fundamental principle of international law and a moral imperative that should guide our actions. Regardless of the political complexities and historical context, we must prioritize the safety and well-being of innocent men, women, and children caught in the crossfire of this protracted conflict. In the occupied Palestinian territory, civilians have endured years of violence, displacement, and a constant state of fear under a ruthless occupation. They face daily challenges that threaten their basic human rights, like access to clean water, health care, education, and a sense of security. The endless indiscriminate use of force by the occupying force, including bombing of schools, shelling of hospitals, and missile attacks on residential areas and camps, has taken a devastating toll on innocent Palestinian lives. It's incumbent upon the international community to act swiftly and decisively to ensure the protection of civilians. First and foremost, it's crucial to establish safe zones and humanitarian corridors to provide essential aid and assistance to those in need. I commend the United Nations Relief and Works Agency's vital role in coordinating relief efforts and emphasizing the need for generous donors to provide the agency with sufficient, predictable, and sustainable funding. Furthermore, we encourage the neighboring countries, civil society, and private sector to redouble their efforts in alleviating the suffering of the Palestinians inside and outside the occupied territories. Second, all parties involved must commit to an immediate unconditional ceasefire and adhere to their obligations under international humanitarian law, which prohibits the targeting of civilians, UN staff, journalists, civilian infrastructure, and safe zones. Accountability for violations must be pursued through impartial investigations, and those responsible for war crimes must be held accountable for their actions. Third, diplomatic efforts need to be intensified to find a lasting and just solution to the conflict. Dialogue, negotiations, and a commitment to a two-state solution are essential to achieving a peaceful coexistence. The international community must actively revive these efforts and encourage all parties to engage in meaningful dialogue with the aim of reaching a comprehensive and a lasting peace agreement. Finally, education and raising awareness are also a crucial component of addressing the conflict. By raising awareness about the plight of the Palestinian people, we can counter misinformation and monopolization of the narrative in order to foster empathy and understanding about their legitimate national aspiration of self-determination. Educating ourselves and future generations about the historical and political context of this conflict can help break down stereotypes and prejudice while achieving a more balanced and nuanced understanding of the situation. In conclusion, the protection of civilians is an urgent and pressing issue that demands our immediate attention at this critical juncture. We must advocate for the respect of international law, establish safe zones, raising awareness about the plight of the Palestinians, and pursue diplomatic solutions to end the conflict. I reiterate that the only viable option for the resolution of the long-standing conflict is the end of the occupation of the Palestinians and the full recognition of a free, sovereign, and independent Palestine with East Jerusalem as its capital in accordance with relevant resolutions of the Security Council and the General Assembly. Somali government and its people will continue to support and stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people and government in their unwavering pursuit of their legitimate rights, including to live in peace within secure and internationally recognized borders. I thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Somalia, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico.
Señor Presidente.
President, it has not yet been 2 years since adoption of Resolution 76/262, and 7 times you have now convened this General Assembly, and vetoes have been exercised on 7 occasions by permanent members of the Security Council. At this time, firstly, we are convened here due to the veto on the last 18th of October by the US to draft Resolution S/2023/773, a draft that had 12 votes in favor, 2 abstentions, and was essentially humanitarian in nature, the aim being to bring an end to the suffering of civilian populations, both in Israel and in Palestine. Mexico believes that any use of the veto to impede action of the Security Council is unacceptable, and this most recent case is no exception. Since 1945, Mexico has had an unshakable position against the use of the veto by permanent members of the Security Council. This faculty has been exercised in breach of the solemn commitment of 4 permanent members on the 7th of June 1945 at the San Francisco conference. At that time, they declared,
It's not to be assumed, however, that the permanent members, any more than the non-permanent members, would use their veto power willfully to obstruct the operation of the Council. The
reality has regrettably been rather different. Let us remind you now that during his statement at the high-level debate at the 77th General Assembly, President Biden said the following:
Members of the UN Security Council, including the United States, should consistently uphold and defend the UN Charter and refrain from the use of veto except in rare, extraordinary situations to ensure that the Council remains credible and effective.
It is regrettable that the veto to the draft resolution S/2023/773 has cast doubt precisely on the credibility and effectiveness of the Council, specifically at a time when its action is so urgently needed. The draft resolution in question was a balanced text and contained the most urgent and most important elements under the current circumstances, and specifically had ensured that the Security Council continues to be credible and effective. Given the gravity and the fragility of the situation on the ground, there is no justification for impeding the adoption of this draft. The first version was actually co-sponsored by Mexico. In addition to this veto, there was another used by Russia and China to draft resolution S/2023/792, this time presented by the delegation of the United States. In this case, after the vote, there were 10 votes in favor, 3 against, and 2 abstentions. In the opinion of my delegation, unlike the Brazilian text that was able to garner more support from members of the Council, this draft did not come from a balanced approach. Nevertheless, a veto is a veto, and my delegation recognizes that having obtained the necessary votes for its adoption, The action of 2 permanent members has once again caused a deadlock in the Security Council. It is important to mention that this last veto was immediately followed by the rejection of draft resolution S/2023/795 that was presented by Russia. This had 4 votes in favor, 2 against, and 9 abstentions. This cycle of mutual rejection declared as a chronicle of a death foretold by both proponents in their interventions at the debate on the Middle East on Wednesday, 24th of October, is also toxic and reflects the dysfunctionality that may now characterize this body. It also reminds us of the bad practices and stalemate from the Cold War period. My delegation issues a call to halt these political tactics that only represent an abuse of the Security Council at the expense of those who are suffering on the ground. We cannot and we must not lose sight of the fact that what is at stake here are human lives. In this context, Mexico reiterates its call to those who have not yet done so to join the French and Mexican initiative on restriction of the use of the veto that now has 106 signatories. President, as we indicated at the Security Council, Mexico condemns in an energetic and unequivocal way terrorism and extremist violence in all of its forms and manifestations, independently of who commits it, where it is committed, under what rationalization. We reiterate our strong condemnation of the terrorist attacks against the people of Israel on the 7th of October committed by Hamas, and we recognize the right of Israel to protect its citizens and territory, as well as that right to guarantee their security, provided that it is done in strict adherence to international law and in full observance of the principles of necessity and proportionality that govern any use of force. Once again, we demand that Hamas immediately and unconditionally release any hostages under its custody, which includes Mexican nationals. We are also concerned by the Israeli response, and in agreement with, according to OCHA, has so far caused more than 8,000 deaths, 21,000 injured, in addition to incalculable damage to infrastructure and civilian property in Palestine. It is awful to note that day after day since the resumption of this session, this number continues to increase. This must end. We condemn any indiscriminate attacks directed at a civilian population under any circumstances, as well as any attacks against medical or humanitarian personnel or against civilian property and infrastructure that is essential, that may in fact constitute war crimes. Mexico reiterates its call for an immediate and lasting cessation to hostilities in all of the occupied Palestinian territories, specifically direct or indirect attacks against civilians by all parties to the conflict. We also call for a lifting of the siege that is currently being inflicted upon the Palestinian population, given that reprisals are in breach of international law. We welcome the beginning of the arrival of humanitarian convoys to Gaza, but this is not enough. The provision of basic services, as well as the lifting of restrictions to the movement of people and goods, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, is vital. Similarly, the passage of civilian people through this humanitarian corridor should also be allowed. We profoundly regret the death of United Nations staff, and we issue a call for a revocation of the decision to withdraw the visas to UN operatives in Israel. We also wish to take this opportunity to reconfirm our total support to the Secretary-General Antonio Guterres and the entire United Nations system in their political and humanitarian efforts at this time of crisis. In light of the grave humanitarian situation in the region, Mexico will increase its voluntary contribution to UNRWA in recognition of their humanitarian work, which is now more necessary than ever. President, any occupation is illicit. It undermines the international order and contravenes the Charter of the United Nations. There is no right to an unlimited occupation. Any acquisition of territory by force is null and void. We demand that the occupying power ceases its occupation and any other acts that affect the territorial integrity of the State of Palestine in compliance with the relevant resolutions of the Security Council. Mexico is in favor of a complete and definitive solution to the conflict under the principle of two states in a way that addresses the legitimate concerns for security of Israel and that enables the consolidation of a state of Palestine that is politically and economically viable and that lives alongside Israel within secure and internationally recognized borders in accordance with the relevant resolutions of the United Nations Security Council, as highlighted by Mexico's Foreign Ministry on the 23rd of September at this pulpit. We must recognize the right of the people to Israel, but not at the expense of the Palestinian people. In conclusion, President, we hope that the Security Council can live up to the gravity of this situation and take prompt action, firstly to ensure that there is an end to the loss of life and that we open a new chapter for humanitarian assistance and political dialogue. It is at the darkest hours when it is most difficult to see any hope on the horizon that we are forced to redouble our effort to put an end to the cycle of violence and ensure that a viable solution to two states and two people is possible and they can live in peace. They must make this a reality and live up to the principles that we laid down 78 years ago. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Mexico and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Madam President, 50 years ago this month, the 1973 Arab-Israeli War began. 30 years ago, the Oslo Accords were signed. 26 years ago, the first meeting of the 10th Emergency Special Session of this body was held. Who could have imagined we would still be here today? The horrifying series of events that began on 7 October continues unabated, spiraling ever downwards with far too many losses. Japan extends its sincere condolences to the families of the victims. Japan once again unequivocally condemns Hamas's brutal terror attack on Israel and its taking of hostages. The international community should never tolerate such heinous acts. Every member state has a right to defend itself and its people, and such right must be exercised in accordance with international law. Just recently, Israel announced an expansion of its ground operation in Gaza. The humanitarian situation in Gaza has never been worse. It is catastrophic, and the Palestinian people are in desperate need of food, water, fuel, and medicine. We also extend our sincere condolences to the families of the victims and for the loss of UN staff and personnel. This meeting was convened because the Security Council has repeatedly failed to take action. The Security Council